listening to How to Get Over Your Ex, episode number 131, When Your Ex is Struggling with Addiction with Karilyn Ivers. Welcome to How to Get Over Your Ex, a podcast on getting over your ex without it just taking time. I'm your host, Breakup Coach Dorothy. Let's turn your pain into power and your heartbreak into happy. Hello, my beautiful Bravehearts. How is everyone doing? I have a special guest for us today, Miss Karilyn Ivers. Love her. She is a coach that has been inside of the Get Over Your Ex program multiple times, talking about feeling feelings and all of her expertise. And I've had a couple of Bravehearts recently reach out wanting to talk about the topic around when your partner or your ex-partner is struggling with addiction and all the questions that come up with that. So in this episode with Karilyn, we're talking all about it. We're going to talk about guilt that you might have knowing you couldn't help them. What do you do when your ex was blaming you for their addiction? All of it. So I am so excited for this episode. I hope you love it as much as I do, and I will talk to you later. Hello, Karilyn. So excited to have you here. This is a long time coming. Karilyn has been inside of the Get Over Your Ex program multiple times. Actually, once as a client and then a lot of times as a coach. So That's super fun. Okay. So let's just dive right in. We just started talking and we were like, okay, stop. We need to hit record because it's going to be so juicy and so good. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Karilyn, why don't you just kick us off by telling us who you are, introduce us, tell us how you got to where you are. You are now a coach who coaches people who are dating individuals that have addiction, but like go into your whole spiel. Tell us how you got there. We want to know all about you.
Oh Lord, where do we start? Okay. So years ago, I met someone, and on our first date, he told me that he had struggled with addiction and he had been sober for like 7 months at that point. And I had no idea what any of that meant. I had no background knowledge of addiction, substance abuse issues. I have an uncle who struggled with alcoholism, but like I didn't really even know that much about it. So completely naive going into that. But I wasn't even looking for a serious relationship. So like the bar was low. Like, A, I didn't know what that meant, but B, it didn't really matter to me at the time. So I kind of was like, okay, well, you seem like you're in a good place now. And he had a job and a car, and he seemed like a functioning human being, and he was really hot and really funny, and we had a really good connection, and we like had some similar interests, and so sparks, all that stuff, and wouldn't you know it, I fell in love with him. And so a couple months into our relationship, little did I know he was declining into a relapse, like a serious relapse. And he struggled with, at that point, it was heroin, but he had gone through heroin, meth. He'd used, pot before that. I mean, I'm sure he's used every drug there is, but at that point it was heroin. And I, again, no idea what that looks like when you're around someone who's on heroin, like what the signs of relapse are. So I had no idea this was happening. And there was even a point where I was at his place and I went into the bathroom and I saw this little like black rock looking thing in a little baggie. And you would think that would tip me off. But when you've never seen heroin before, you don't know what it is when you see it. So
I literally no idea. I wouldn't have known. I would have been he collects crystals.
Right. It literally looks like, like smoke amethyst or something, gray stone. I don't know. It's just a little black rock in a little baggie. It looked like nothing. And that was heroin. And so I picked it up And I took it into the other room and I was like, oh, hey, what's this? Because I did have like a little twinge of, what is this? But I was so committed to giving him the benefit of the doubt just because like that's how much in love with him I was. So it was not gonna, I was not gonna push it. And so I just went in there. I was like, oh, hey, what's this? And he looked at me and he's like, I don't know. I don't know what that. Here, give it that to me. Let me take that into the other room. I don't know. And he just like really played it off. And, looking back, I'm like, wow, I would never fall for that again. But I did that time. And he was like, oh, I think it's just a cookie left over from something. And I was like, okay.
A
Like, you know, I was like,
cookie?
that's weird.
He could have told you it was a smoked amethyst, and we would have been
Right.
like, yes,
And
of
I
course.
would've
That makes total sense.
like,
you just bought it from the
cool.
store. They put it in a baggie for you. Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, totally. So, um, yeah. Oh my gosh, this is such a long story. But yeah, so that was like the beginning and multiple rounds of lies and just things that happened and broke up and got back together multiple times. And then at some point, maybe like a year and a half into this whole saga, now it had escalated from heroin to meth. And meth and compulsive sexual behavior are very closely linked. And so he was getting his drugs from sex workers and then hiring the sex workers and then sleeping with them when he was high. So I found that out shockingly kind of early on and was just very much confused because if you don't know anything about this, it's like, is this just the addiction or is he like an asshole? Like, is he just a piece of shit or like, is this like something he really has no control over? And if that's the case, how much compassion do I need to have? Like, how understanding should I be? Are my standards different when it's something he really can't control? So that was the confusing part. But he sat me down one day and like told me that he had relapsed. And that means he slept with someone or multiple someones. And I was like, oh, okay. This was after another get back together. And I was like being super cautious about things. But I was like, at this point, I need to either completely walk away from him forever or I need to get some serious help for myself because he's not doing anything. So I wasn't ready to leave. You might think that sounds ridiculous, but if you know, you know. And I was not ready to make that decision. So I hired a life coach. I learned a lot more about addiction. I learned a lot more about myself and what was okay to have boundaries around and like learning it's okay for me to not be comfortable with this kind of behavior and like none of this is my fault and I don't have to feel guilty for like not supporting him when he's in his addiction. So eventually a couple more rounds of being sober and then relapses again. And I finally got to the place where I was like, I don't want this in my life. I don't want to be with someone who literally cannot help sleeping with people. Like, whatever you believe, we'll talk about this more, but like, there's different schools of thought on what addiction is and how much choice someone has. But it didn't matter whether he was choosing it or not, it was happening. And I was like, okay, I think this is my line. I deserve a relationship where I don't have to be worried about my partner sleeping with people and like having to deal with STIs and all that stuff. I was just like, I just don't want that. So that was the final breakup. There was still some more like emotional entanglement after that, but we never like officially got back together. So in the process, like I was becoming a life coach during this like last relapse of his. And I was like, yeah, I never want to coach on this because I was like so emotionally exhausted by it. But after we broke up and I started coaching, I realized this is a huge issue that very few people are talking about. When I was looking for support, I really never found the clicked and really helped me. I found several different resources that did help, but I needed something more. And so I was like, I want to be the resource that I couldn't find. And because it's so common addiction. And it's very confusing because no one's talking about it. So that's how I got here.
I love it. There's so many like parallels to that story that I think are so interesting. Cause I feel like I know you like pretty well. I mean, we talk fairly often, but I don't think I've ever actually like heard that story from start to finish from you.
Oh my God. Well, there's
And
more. So
I can't wait. I cannot wait. And so I think that's really cool. But that's why I decided to do life coaching in terms of breakups is like I wanted to be the solution that I didn't have when I
Mhm.
was going through it.
Yeah.
And then going back to your original story, I found it really fascinating because I'm like, I feel like I went through the same journey without the addiction piece of like choosing to leave a relationship. It was like there was literally nothing like wrong, quote unquote, wrong in my relationship. Like
Yeah.
he didn't have an addiction or he didn't um what's the word? Like he wasn't cheating or anything like that, but I still had to do the work in the relationship to then
Yeah.
decide to leave.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful way of doing it. Like I loved that. It was such
Yeah.
a different kind of way of doing it. So then also that actually I want to talk this leads us perfectly into because
Great.
when I was leaving that relationship um something that had come up for me I don't even know where to start this. So it's where I want to talk about how do we know if someone has an addiction?
Yeah.
And I come from a background where my biological father was an alcoholic, but I wasn't ever around him. Like my mom decided to raise me not with my biological father. I had a father who was at my birth that raised me, who I
Mhm.
called dad, and he never had a drop of alcohol in his life
Mm.
ever and still hasn't. And so I have these two very like, and then my mom's father was an alcoholic. And so growing up, I have this psychologist dad who has never drank alcohol or coffee or any kind of substance ever, period. And he taught me very much that like all of this was bad and it's not good. And
Yeah.
don't you dare ever have a drink because you will
Mm.
become addicted. And
Mm.
it's been a very fascinating thing for me in my adult life now because anytime I see someone having a beer every night after work, I'm like, "Oh my God, they're an alcoholic." And
Mm.
my
Yeah.
brain like goes off as if it's an alarm. And so now I feel like my default thought patterns when it comes to alcoholism specifically,
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how do I know if someone's an alcoholic?" And when you look at the DSM or you look at some of those other tools or the things the internet provides you, it seems so fucking subjective. like, and I'm like, but some people are functioning very well off when when they're consuming what I feel like is a lot of substance and yet they're still doing their day-to-day stuff. So then is it a problem or is it not a problem? So can you
Mm.
talk more about that?
Yes. So it's okay. Let me start off with the definition that I have gotten from Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a renowned psychologist who works in the addiction space, and he's very like trauma informed. And so I really respect his work. And he has three criteria for if something's an addiction. Firstly, you crave the substance or the behavior. Secondly, you engage in the substance or behavior in order to experience pleasure or temporary relief from some kind of pain. And third, you have an inability to give it up despite negative consequences. So that applies to literally any behavior or substance, not just alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, all that stuff, but it could be sugar, it could be relationships it could be a specific person in your life that you engage with and cannot give up. That will be relevant in a moment to our conversation. But that's the thing, is addiction. We have this idea that addiction itself is bad and is a serious problem, because when we think of addiction, we think of drug addiction, and it's like that can become lethal very quickly, right? Because that's just the nature of the substance. But addiction itself is just your craving for something that you do in order to feel something or not feel something, usually get away from pain, numb pain, and then you can't give it up, even if it's causing problems in your life, whatever those problems are. That is a very wide range. And so you can have an addiction without realizing it's a problem for you. You could be in a relationship with someone who has an addiction and it's not a quote unquote problem because they haven't gotten fired from their job yet. But like, of course, yeah, they're still functioning. They're still somewhat emotionally available to whatever extent you think is normal. But that doesn't mean there's not some issue underlying that. And so the most common denominator for all kinds of most addiction is some form of trauma. And that doesn't have to be a traumatic, like abusive childhood. It doesn't have to mean like you were accosted or abused or assaulted or any of that. Trauma is just too much, too soon, too fast. So for example, if your boyfriend in middle school wanted to go too far, too fast, that's trauma. If you're a child and your parent gives you too much responsibility, like they make it your responsibility to manage their emotions, that's trauma. That's too much, too soon. So when we think of trauma, a lot of us are like, no, I had a fine childhood. But I mean, you might not be conscious of it, but a lot of us actually have some form of trauma, wherever it is on the scale, whether it's subtle or very, like my partner had like a lot of very intense. Anyone looking at that would be like, damn, that's a traumatic childhood. But like, I don't know, when I was dating my husband, like, you know, he moved too fast for me. And that actually was pretty traumatizing. It really affected our whole entire marriage for 10 years. And I wouldn't necessarily think of that like, oh, I have trauma. But so that's what addiction is. It's basically just a coping mechanism. It's a response. It's a normal human response to something that we don't know how to handle.
So then talk to us a little bit about what are the main differences that you find when it comes to getting over an ex who is an addict versus not?
So I want to address the term addict, first of all, because like with that definition of addiction, like most of us could identify something we use as a coping mechanism to feel better.
Sure.
Or to avoid pain. So I would ask your listeners, when you think about the way you feel about your ex, do you feel a craving to have them in your life? Do you act on that craving? Like, do you want to reach out to them all the time in order to feel better? And is it really hard for you to stop doing that action?
Right.
A lot of us
probably say yes.
would say yes. So are you going to call yourself an addict? Because that's the definition of addiction. So probably not, because it feels shitty. That word has a lot of shame and stigma to it. But a lot of us could identify as addicts in some form. I just don't find the term very useful because
So would you just say instead say struggling with addiction?
Yeah.
Okay. So then what's the difference? Or is there a difference? Would you consider that there's a difference between
So I
individuals
don't
getting help?
really, yeah, I don't really think there is much of a difference. Honestly, I was trying to think about this. I saw the question before we got on and I was like, yeah. But then on second thought, no, actually, there's really not.
Yeah, I think
um,
that one of the main things that I saw that I found just like fascinating and interesting is the shame and the guilt around that the other person tries to place on the person getting over their ex. Like,
yeah,
but that could, like you said, that could happen regardless of whether or not your ex partner is struggling with addiction. Like, I see it
yeah.
even in other circumstances and situations. But that is something that I was like, ooh, I would love to talk to you about when it comes to like, how does someone, I have my answer to this, but I am more curious about your answer with your experience of this. But how do you handle, or how would you, solve, do I say the word solve the part of the guilt and the shame for not, I don't even know how to put that, not fighting for them or not helping them through their issues or their addiction?
Well, I think that's a different question. I want to give you more of an answer to the first question, which was what's the
Okay.
difference? And I definitely want to come back to that question.
Okay.
But I think the biggest difference is just someone's thoughts about their ex who struggles with addiction versus someone's thoughts about someone who didn't struggle with
Mm,
addiction.
yeah.
Like really getting stuck on who their ex was when they were sober versus who they showed up as when they were in active addiction or using.
So good.
And there's a lot of like black and white thinking, like that's two different people. My clients say this to me all the time. They're like, they're not this, they're a whole different person when they're using. And the reason I want to point out that that's not true is because then you get attached to this quote unquote person who's sober and you get attached to the potential of who that person could be. And you only want that part of this person, but they're not two different people. It's the same person struggling with the same issue, regardless of whether they're using or not. If they're happy and they're treating you well and you're having a good day, that doesn't mean they've resolved the trauma that's causing their addiction. I had a lot of really good times with my partner and like positive conversations and like hiking and had so much in common, but that didn't heal the underlying trauma he had. Like he was always the person who was struggling with that pain, whether he showed it or not. So I think it's dangerous for us to separate them into two people because now you're not really loving your partner. You're loving this idea you have of who they could be the whole time. But
Which
we're not just
people,
one side.
yes, which people struggle with again, regardless of whether or not your
Yeah.
ex is struggling with addiction, right? We
Yep.
say like we're in love with their potential, not the
Mhm.
actual human being they are being today, how they were showing up today.
Right. Because that's also who they are. We want to separate. Oh, this is who they, oh, this is not really who they are. This is just how they're just having a bad day or they're just struggling with addiction. It's not really who they are. And like, yes, I actually do believe someone is not defined by the struggle that they have, but they are the whole person. That is them, how they're showing up. Like, if you're not willing to love them in this, like, if you're not choosing to feel love toward all of that, then you're not really loving the whole person. And I don't say that to be like, oh, you're like lame for leaving this person because they struggle with addiction. No, you're allowed to want what you want and want safety and dependability and trust and honesty and all that. Um, but it's just like you're not seeing the whole person and you're lying to yourself about Like, oh, if they just got rid of their addiction, everything would be perfect.
Mhm.
No.
Yep.
They'd still be them.
Oh, it's so relevant to all breakups too. That is like
Yeah.
exactly what we do in all breakups, regardless if there's addiction or not.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so fascinating. So good to see. I love that.
So, to answer your next question about the guilt that comes up, um,
It's like guilt around, I reread my question and how I wrote it originally, but it was like dealing
yeah.
with guilt of leaving them, knowing you couldn't help them.
Well, the guilt there is a big false assumption. It's
Mhm.
assuming that you ever had the power to help them. If you ask anyone who's in recovery from addiction, they will tell you that no one could have helped them before they were ready to be helped. If they're not ready, they're not ready. And there's nothing you can do, and it's not your fault. You're not making it worse, but you're also not going to make it better. Like, you can't heal that for them. That's something they have to do, the processing, the introspection, the integrating all of that pain back into who they are. Like, the guilt is a lie that you're telling yourself, that you're doing something wrong for having putting yourself first and realizing, like, well, I need to go after what I want and need. It's
Mic
like
drop. So good.
we have this thought that we're abandoning them because, like, we think there's also the whole narrative around addiction being a disease. And I just don't think that's very useful, because then it becomes like hopeless. Like, well, I can manage this disease, but it's never going to be cured. But it's not a disease that you can't heal.
Why do we even
It's
call it a disease? Like, that's so crazy to me that we even call it a disease. Cause I'm sitting here, like the way you just explained it earlier, it's like we all do this with
we literally
something.
all do this. Yeah.
So then we all have diseases. So then why are we even calling it that? It's so crazy. That's
Well, I think
wild.
it goes back to like psychologists trying to diagnose, like, because the certain substances do have an effect on your brain. However, it's still only a symptom of trauma, and trauma isn't a disease. It's an experience that needs to be healed, like, and felt and integrated. It's just it's just human beings being human beings. It's just like our life.
Yeah.
So I think the disease model came from medicine and trying to make things pathology that can be like treated with medicine and stuff like that. And it's also it's an easy way out of saying, like, I've talked to Andrew Wild is an addiction mentor, and he's been on my podcast. And but the way he talks about it, it's like, oh, I get to call it a disease? Great. Yeah, it's totally a disease. That means I don't have to take any responsibility for healing my own shit. Because a
Mm,
disease, you just take some pills, maybe go 12-step meetings every day for the rest of your life to manage something. But, like, you don't really have to look at yourself. But it's also not a choice. So this was my big confusion, was like, okay, is it a disease or is it a choice? It can only be one of those two things. It's neither. It's a coping mechanism that's like, this is unconscious stuff happening as a result of, your experience. That doesn't mean, like, yes, all of this is compulsive. This is like the unintentional model at work. Like, your unintentional thoughts and responses are running the show, but you can heal that by bringing awareness to it. But you can only do that when you're ready. And, like, how are we ever ready for anything? We just live our life, and life shows us when we're ready. Like, life
right.
brings us a bunch of things, and then eventually, at some point, or not, because not everyone heals this in their lifetime, this lifetime. So that's a thing that was really confusing for me. No, it's not. And I'm just going to say this is my opinion for, legal reasons or whatever. Don't at me. This is my opinion that it is neither a disease nor a choice, but it is a coping mechanism in response to trauma. So I don't believe, like, my partner would tell me about the level of compulsion he felt to do these things. It made me mad, but like now I'm like, I believe you. Like, I believe you felt so compelled that you don't have any other tools to deal with the urge. It's an urge, right? And when we
Mhm.
talk about like over desire for
Yeah.
things and the urge to do something, he didn't know how to process that urge and allow it and sit with it and then like do the healing work in between to address the real issue. Addiction is not the real issue. Addiction is a symptom of the real issue, which is pain, an inability to process emotions, trauma.
It feels like that's literally like how I felt about my ex, right? It's like I had this strong desire for my ex and I didn't have the coping mechanisms and I didn't have the solution to how to not follow through on the urges for my ex when I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't have him. So
Yeah.
crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. Okay. So my Bravehearts had a number of other questions that I want to talk to you about. I know they're going to love this already. It's just filled with so many gold nuggets. So thank you so much. One of them was, how do you move on when your ex blamed you for using?
If your ex blamed you for their substance use, that just means they don't yet have the tools or they're not ready to take responsibility for their own addiction. So you cannot you can't cause your partner's addiction. You can't cause them to go worse into their addiction. You can't force them to use. It is not your fault. So they're not telling the truth. They're not being accurate. To them, I'm sure it does feel like you are the cause because you're the circumstance that they then have thoughts about and then they feel the urge to use because they can't deal with like literally any level of difficulty in a relationship. Like, it's really hard for someone who struggles with addiction to be in a relationship because there are ups and downs, there's conflict. You have to navigate that. You have to have a certain level of emotional maturity and ability to soothe yourself and process your own emotions and just to be in a regular, normal relationship. And when you don't have the tools, then of course you think your partner is the cause. So they might think that you caused it, but it's not true. So for you to move on, you need to like have your own back and validate yourself that you are not the cause of someone else's coping mechanism. And for me, the thoughts that helped me the most about my ex who struggles with addiction is that just thinking like he does not have the tools. He doesn't have the tools to treat me the way I deserve to be treated. He just doesn't know how. It doesn't mean he's a bad person. It's just facts. It's like neutral. You can't paint a blue wall if you only have red paint. He only had red paint. Like, uh, drugs were his only tool. That was the only tool in his tool belt. And I am not going to blame him for not having learned the other tools. Like, how could he have known the childhood he grew up? Like, he was modeled the worst coping mechanisms ever. Of course, that's what he learned, how to deal with his pain and like how men are supposed to treat women. And like, yeah, that's his stuff to heal. I don't have to help him heal that. I don't have to stay and wait for him to heal that. But it does help me to have some sort of perspective. Like, of course, he doesn't know how. It's okay. It doesn't mean I'm going to stay around and keep being treated like that, but
And it
also I
doesn't
don't
mean
have
you
to
have to
be
take responsibility. It's like
right.
just because someone blames you doesn't mean that you have to take the blame and put it on. You don't have just because someone's
Right.
like, "Hey, here's your outfit for the day," doesn't mean you have to take it and put that outfit on.
Yes. And I can't teach him these tools, but I can keep learning about myself and I can keep learning about what I need in a relationship and I can keep advocating for myself and setting boundaries and I can go create the relationship I want with someone who does have the tools
I love
if
it.
that's what I want.
Mhm. So good. So good. All right. So then someone else also asked how to get out when you know you need to, but they seem to rely on you for stability or help.
Of course they rely on you for stability and help. Of course they do. Yes, you're damn right they do because you're more stable than they are. But they would figure it out if you stopped allowing them to use you for stability and help. Just because they think they need you doesn't mean that you are now enslaved to them and have to stay no matter how unhealthy it is for you. Like, we are very confused about when people state what they need, like that means we have to give them what they need, regardless of what that means for us. I think this is like a society wide issue. Like, this is how we think relationships work. It's not. You do not owe your partner anything. They don't owe you anything. You just get to make decisions about what you both want. So, like, I would ask yourself now, here's where you get to take responsibility and be introspective. Ask yourself how you are believing that you need them in order to feel stable in your life. Because if we're being honest, that's the real reason you haven't left, because you are believing that you need the relationship. Like, you need to be needed or something. I don't know exactly what that is for you specifically, but what are you believing that has you still in the relationship?
I love that. Very important to look at. I love answering questions with questions too. I'm like,
Yeah.
don't you ever wish you could have them on real time just to like walk through the coaching? I feel like that would be a fun
Yeah.
podcast.
Yes.
Okay, another question that I thought was really good is would you ever take them back after they are clean?
Okay, this is a personal choice, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. I
Everyone hates that
have.
answer. Like I don't
I
want
know.
to hear that there's no right or wrong answer.
There is no right or wrong
Expand,
answer.
expand for us.
But I totally will. Because I had the opportunity to confront this question for myself recently because I had some conversations with my ex over the holidays. And his situation is much better than it was. Like, we hadn't talked for a year, over a year, maybe 2 years. And talking with him now, like, he's doing much better. He has a lot more tools. So I had like this conversation with myself, like, would I ever? Because yeah, back then he totally crossed all kinds of boundaries. So if you're the kind of person who's like, nope, once you do that, I don't want to ever trust you again. Like, I just no, it's just a no for me. But I'm not really absolutist about those kinds of things. So I just found myself feeling open to the question. So here's my personal criteria for, because I had to walk myself through this exercise. Okay, when would I and when would I not? So if my ex did want to get back together, I would want to spend time with him and watch who he is. I would just want to observe him and see who he is over a period of time. Because, and this is the same for anyone, honestly, when you're dating, this is what you need to do, dating a new person. And when you're considering taking someone back, you want to see how they behave consistently over time, because that will tell you all you need to know about where they are at, like spiritually, mental health wise. It doesn't matter what they say. So you can hear their words, but don't take any of that to heart. Like, if they're coming back to you, oh, I've changed, I've done all this stuff. Okay, great. Show me. Show me over the next 6 months how you've really integrated this into your life. That's how you know someone's changed. It doesn't matter how much time they've been sober. That's the most completely useless measure of progress. So that's like, they're like, oh, I've been sober for a year. Like, that's supposed to magically heal you? Like, Dorothy, you know, time doesn't heal shit.
So good.
Time
Oh,
does
I
not
love
matter.
that.
don't put a number on the calendar like when you've been sober 6 months, call me. Like, no. But at 6 months, if you want to check in and like start spending more time with them and watch who they are for the next 6 months, year, and then you get to decide, like over 3 months or whatever, like who are they being? Are they kind? Are they honest? Are they consistent? Are they committed to their own mental health? Are they doing things in support of their recovery? Are they surrounding themselves with a supportive community? Are they taking responsibility for their life? Or are they still blaming other people for their problems? Are they still in victim mentality? Woe is me. Like, this is just like so awful. I'll never get over this kind of thing. I just need you. I need you in my life to help me, support me, and then I'll be fine. Like, are they still putting the responsibility on you or other people or their sponsor or whatever? Because that's what you want to look at.
That is so good. I'm glad you brought this up. I recently did a mini lesson inside of like an OVRX program about evaluating your relationships,
Mm.
because that's something that I started doing with my romantic partnership with Jake. Is
Mhm.
every 6 months we look at the relationship and look at our wants and see if they still match. And not only that, but looking at how are we showing up and are the actions that are being made by each of us in alignment with those wants. And it's been like
Yes.
game changer for me, because I think that that's where it drove me nuts in my last relationship, where it was like all these words were being said about the future, but then the
Yeah.
action never was there. And
Yeah.
I just got so tired of that. So I was like, oh, I'll just evaluate this every 6 months and see what
Yeah.
happens. And it's so
Yeah.
much easier. So I think that that's amazing. I love that. And you know me, I'm never against someone getting back together with their ex when it's what's right for them. Only you know
Mhm.
that.
Yeah. And there's a lot out there from people saying, like, never get into a relationship with someone struggling with addiction. If soon as you know, you need to leave. Like, and how dare you tell people that they shouldn't leave a relationship where addiction is present? And there's just a lot of like thinking
Shoulding.
people know what's the best answer. And it's like, you don't, because everyone has their own lessons to learn. And I love the lessons I learned in that relationship. I would not take it back for a second. I would do it all over again. And I say that knowing how much pain was involved because, like, it was it's so empowering to know those things now and be able to teach other people about them.
And look
Like,
at who you
yeah,
are because of all of that. Like, that's
yeah,
what's crazy to me, is like you had to go through all of that. You are who you are today because of your experience in that.
yeah.
And I think that's the beauty of all relationships in general, is you
Mhm.
learn so much about yourself when you are in a relationship. And I almost feel like sometimes we go to the extreme of giving a bad rap of like, know yourself well enough, be single long enough so that you love yourself first and then get into a relationship. And I'm like, you can learn all of that stuff inside or outside of a relationship. They're just two different experiences. It's not
Yep.
best or worst or right or wrong. Like you were saying, the very beginning of this, question, there's no right or wrong answer. It is literally just different experiences, and you might experience all of them. Which one do you want to experience first?
Yeah. And now that I've had both, because prior to that, I wasn't single for like over a decade. And I was the person who went from relationship to relationship and I learned a lot about myself. And then over the last year, I've had a lot of time not dating, being single, like I'm just doing my own thing. And I've also really loved what I've learned about myself from that. So I think they're both very valuable experiences, but you get to decide which one you want at any given time.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Okay. So the other question that I have is, how do you learn to move on after those overdose moments and bad moments?
First of all, what are you making it mean that that
Mhm.
happened?
Yeah.
And are you thinking that you have to avoid that experience forever? Like, are you thinking that you can't let that happen again? Because if that's the goal, then you're going to be very frustrated and scared. Like you're just going to live your life in fear. And I love telling this story, but literally, you coached me on this exact issue of me being terrified to be lied to again and be cheated on again. And you asked me, like, what if you don't have to keep it from happening again? And I was like, what? That's an option? Like, like I don't. And then it like blew my mind. I had a complete mind blown moment. Like I don't have to keep it. I've been thinking that I have to keep it from happening again, but I don't have to believe that I have to keep it from happening again. And the way I show up when I don't think I have to stop it from happening is I'm not trying to control it. I just let it, I just observe what's happening and then I make decisions along the way. But if you're thinking you have to keep the bad moments from happening, if you have to prevent an overdose, first of all, that is not within your control. If you try to put it in your control, you will have a heart attack from anxiety at a very young age in life.
Trying to control all the humans.
It will ruin your life if you make it your job to prevent someone else from having an overdose. And listen, it's a very real fear. I have had clients whose partners have died from overdose. I've had clients whose partners have committed suicide in addiction. Damn, I feel like crying right now. But yes, it happens. And that's like the shittiest part of my job is shit gets real sometimes. But then you have to process all these feelings of guilt all over again. Because first of all, we have these feelings of guilt ahead of time when they're in the addiction. And then we totally blame ourselves for not being able to prevent it. But that was never the case. You were never going to be able to prevent it. And it doesn't mean that your partner was bad or wrong or weak or selfish or whatever. It just means they didn't get the opportunity to learn these tools in this lifetime. That's how I think about it. And I always bring up the conversation about what do you believe about death and what do you want to believe about death? Because the reason it's so horrible for us is because of what we think about death. I think you and I have a very freeing idea of what death even is, which is that it doesn't even exist. Like for our souls, like this shit never ends. We are having a eternal experience. And so that thought for me is the most freeing, beautiful thought. And the truth is you don't know. So either way you think about it, you're making it up. If we're being honest.
Yep.
So do you want to make up a lot of really painful things to think about? Or do you want to make up something that feels good, that you can feel at peace with and feel more connection to that person, even though they're not having this physical experience with you anymore? This really took a turn in the conversation, but
no, but my heart feels so full talking about that. Like, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think that is a very real conversation that anyone who's here listening to this episode probably wants to know about and wants to talk with you about. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just don't go ahead.
I don't want us to like be like, oh, just don't think about it. Like, just, it won't happen, or, you don't have to deal with it. But yeah, it could happen, and it does happen. And so what do we want to believe now that we have the fact that things happen? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So good. So good. I feel so complete. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. I know it's going to be so beneficial. I've had actually in like the last month, I feel like I've had multiple Bravehearts reach out asking about, can we talk about this topic? So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And I also now am like so glad you told me about the word addict in the first place. So I'm like, I 100% feel way more comfortable talking about this topic when I say struggling with addiction. Like I felt resistance in my body
Right?
when
It
that
doesn't feel
word
good to
happened.
say either.
It's so wild. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for saying that. Okay.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Please make sure, how can people find you? Like, where do you want them to come hang out with you at? Where can they find you if they want to hear more about all your amazing teachings in the world, or if they want to come work with you? How can they find you?
So I have a podcast called Your Partner's Addiction. You can look that up anywhere you are listening to this podcast right now. And you can find me on Instagram at Karilyn Ivers, and the correct spelling will be in the show notes. And you can also find me on my website, KarylynIvers.com.
And I'll link all of her things in the show notes for anyone listening. Awesome. Thank you, Boo. I appreciate you. I love you.
Love you too. Thanks for having me.
If you're loving the How to Get Over Your Ex podcast and you want to learn how to get over your ex in 3 months or less to build a life better than the one you thought you had with your ex, I would like to personally invite you to my next group course where we take everything you've learned here on the podcast and apply it to your life. Come check it out at www.lifecoachdorothy.com.